I've got another wild comment thread to share with you guys, so let's take a look. They start with a sentence I actually really like. Beauty of language is that the path of least resistance always wins. But then it starts to go off the rails. We wouldn't have developed gendered language if it was more practical to have non-gendered language. It's not like gendered language is the new kid on the block that's making every language better. Gender has been around since our oldest records and oldest reconstructions. In fact, English used to have grammatical gender, but now it doesn't. We have some words like actor and actress, which are different for human genders, but they don't have different declensions or different articles because of their grammatical gender. And some sources say about a quarter of the world's languages use gender. Some might say about 38% of people speak a gendered language. Some might say as much as 44% of languages in the world have grammatical gender. But that's still not even a majority. So if it's so obviously better, why don't all languages have it? And why did English evolve away from it? When narrating a story with 5 individuals, a 50-50 split in pronouns will facilitate listening because we are sexually dimorphous mammalians. Gendered languages can narrate a story with 5 individuals where they all have the same pronoun. Why is a 50-50 split better instead of a 20-20-20-20-20? Some languages have 5 genders. Why not make them all different? Non-gendered languages can still differentiate pronouns with things like obviation. I think that also assumes that gender is useful because we're sexually dimorphous. But grammatical gender isn't necessarily the same as human gender. Some languages have as many as like 20 different genders. Some languages differentiate by animate and inanimate, which is what people think Proto-Indo-European originally did. And in some languages like Dutch, the masculine and feminine actually merge to become one gender, the common gender. So there's no difference between masculine and feminine. A language with 50 words is less useful than one with 5,000. Now I can agree with that, but I don't think that's a good example. Exactly how many words are in a given language is impossible to say. But any natural language has way more than 5,000 words. Even if we agree that French has 100,000 and English has 500,000 words, the vast majority of all these words are hardly ever used. People tend to use less than 2,000 unique words in a day. And you can be fluent in a language by knowing about 10,000 words or less. So is 500,000 words any more useful than 100,000? I don't think so. Here's the craziest quote: complexity suggests improvement. Why? Then why did English get rid of case marking? Why did English get rid of genders? Why does English have so many fewer verb conjugations today than it did in the past? It was an example to show that languages can be clearly ranked. Where's the ranking? They have selection pressures, which is why they evolved. Now that's certainly a thing. Top-down interference is frustrating as it is inorganic. We'll get back to that. If I say nuclear fission, you know I'm referring to a fairly complex concept that 1,000 years ago would have required many more words to explain, right? This suggests that complexity optimizes speech. Don't you think that nuclear fission, 2 words with 4 syllables, is less complex than using an entire sentence or more to explain the same concept? We say that a language is the transference of a byte of information, then a language that condenses more into a byte will be a superior language. A byte is an amount of information. You can't condense more into a byte because then it would be more than a byte. It's like putting more water into a liter of water. You just have more than a liter. But you're not the first person to think about languages transferring bytes of information. You might have seen this graphic before. This comes from this study, and this is their original graphic. On the left, we have the syllable rate of languages. So how many syllables per second are spoken on average? Some we can see are much faster than others. And then on the right, we have the information rate in bytes per second. What they found was that the speed of their speech does not determine the speed of the information conveyed. Basque is spoken relatively quickly, but conveys fewer bytes per second. Whereas languages with fewer syllables per second, like English and French, convey more bytes per second than even the fastest languages. The difference isn't that great. They all average pretty close to 39 bits per second. Wouldn't that make English and French the most efficient despite your complaints? French has disgusting bloat that the Academy won't address. Again, this is despite the fact that French conveys the most bits per second, that the Academy won't address. Isn't this the problem that you were just talking about? If the Academy addresses it, that's top-down interference, that's inorganic. That's exactly what linguists complain about. But you think the fact that French has evolved despite the Academy's efforts is what's making it worse? Chinese has a superior approach to grammar. You know what Chinese doesn't have? Gender. In English, you can say the sentence, she gives it to him, with those gendered pronouns you so adore. In Chinese, you would say the equivalent of they give they, with the singular gender-neutral they, and a verb that never conjugates for anything. Here's a nice complex verb conjugation chart, which you should like, which is just a little bit. There's as many as 142 different verb conjugations to learn in Spanish. And here's a Chinese verb conjugation chart. The verb never changes. They don't have gender, they don't have plurals, so that must be what makes Chinese grammatically superior. You also mention weekdays in Chinese. The translations for weekdays in Chinese is like saying week 1, week 2, week 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That seems more complex than having an individual name for every day of the week. Oh, and now here we have a ranking, not a linguistic source, just a made-up ranking. French is disastrously stupid. Spelling, accents, everything. Spelling is not part of the natural language. So if you're complaining about things that are inorganic, don't mention spelling. Accents, are we talking about the diacritic marks on French letters? If so, forget about them because they're not the natural language. If you're talking about the pronunciation of how they speak, what is so bad about it? What makes one phoneme superior to another? They both convey a bit of information. Languages all over the world can sound completely different, yet still convey the same information at the same rate. Spanish is superior, Chinese is the best. Again, this is Spanish complexity and Chinese complexity. I asked, is there a linguistic source for these rankings, or are you just ranking them however you feel? They said yes, assuming they mean they just rank them however they feel. When is that a reason ranking is not permitted? I didn't say ranking is not permitted. I asked if there was a source for it. They say I want to de-optimize English for ideological reasons. This is the ideology they're referring to. I said the plural pronoun you replaced thou, and now y'all is replacing you. I thought it'd be fun if we do that for all the pronouns. I, he, she, it would take on the plural we and they, which now are singular, and then the plurals would become wall and all, just like y'all. My ideological reason was that my mom keeps asking me when I'm gonna have grandkids anytime I mention a she, and I just wanted to avoid that. Is that really so bothersome that you have to claim some languages are superior to others because they're more complex, when the ones you say are the best are the ones that have the least complexity in their grammar? The onus is on me to prove it anyway, since I invite the change. I have to prove that the they-them modification benefits the language. Singular they-them is awful. Singular they-them isn't even something I modified. You can look at the research in the records. Singular non-binary they-them has been in use since the 13th century. Oxford English Dictionary says the first written use is in 1375. And I suggested the change so that I can talk about a woman without my mom knowing that I'm talking about a woman. I asked if there's any academic articles that support the idea of ranking a language. Now they say it's multivariate. You can rank it on whatever you want. The ease of learning, which first of all, that entirely depends. For example, I find learning Portuguese pretty easy because I already speak Spanish. But if you don't speak another Romance language, it's probably a lot harder for you to learn. Or we can rank their superior based on critically regarded published works. English is the international language of academia and research. It has the most published works, no matter what the features of the language are. Those features, by the way, are no gender, no case marking outside of pronouns, and a heavily simplified and collapsed verb conjugation system. Ranked by phoneticism, Spanish beats French. Surely you can agree on that? I do agree on that, but again, that's not the natural language, that's writing, that's inorganic. Let me go back to your very first sentence, because I think you put it really well. The beauty of language is that the path of least resistance always wins. Old English had 3 genders, 4 cases, a ton of verb conjugations and noun declensions. But now it's lost almost all of that. Why? Because it fit the language. It was useful to its speakers the way it became. Languages are constantly evolving. Gender systems arise, gender systems collapse. Verb conjugations, noun declensions, they come and go. Tons of languages around the world don't have gendered pronouns. Gender does help with some things. It classifies things into groups. So instead of saying, can you hand me the knife, you can say, can you hand me it? And because of the gender, it would be unique and differentiated from other surrounding objects with a different gender. And obviously, without genders, that means there's fewer pronouns to go around. So it might be more confusing if you just say things like it. But if that becomes such a problem that it confuses people, you can just say, can you hand me the knife? You can just use the name of the thing or the person that you're referring to. If you think saying, can you talk to him or can you talk to them is so confusing, you can just say, can you talk to Carson? Individuals have names that you can refer to them by. You don't need pronouns. Languages keep changing in different ways, keep becoming more different and more similar in different ways, because there's no one way that is the most optimal. If there's one thing that was the best, all the languages would have evolved to be like that. There's a reason crustaceans keep evolving into crabs, because that's the most optimal form for them. Languages don't have a most optimal form that they're constantly trying to reach. What is optimal for English speakers is not necessarily optimal for Chinese speakers, and what's optimal for English speakers today isn't the same as it was in the past or it will be in the future. Language is not a crustacean. Languages aren't all evolving to the final form. They're evolving differently because they can all achieve the same thing in different ways. And that diversity is what makes them incredible. Every accent, every dialect, every language, the way everybody speaks around the world are all equally valid and beautiful.